I brought the wood back to my shop and I unloaded it onto my table saw to acclimate in my shop. And now I just needed to rip the boards down to the final width for the size top that I wanted. I find that a top over 40 inches is going to give you the best chance at avoiding prying hands from stealing your food across the table. Now, of course, if you're an unabashed food stealer, you may want to go narrower for full table access. And when you're joining two boards that'll be glued together, the best option is to fold them up onto their sides like you're closing a book right along that joint. Then take the boards to the joiner in that exact orientation. Now, this is going to eliminate any gaps caused by a slightly out of square setup on your joiner. I went through and I folded up each set of mating boards that had gaps and I ran them through until everything fit tightly. Now after that, I laid the wood back down on the table and I set it up how I wanted it for my finished product. I put a big V across all the boards with a pencil as a reference mark to keep them in order. Then I went through and I made marks across the joints about 20 inches apart for every board, and this will be for biscuits that I'm going to use for alignment during the glue up. I cut the biscuit slots on the mating boards using the marks across the joints as indicators. And just be careful to make sure that the biscuit joiner fence is rested firmly on the board. Now without knowing it, I cut this slot too high as because the dust hose was hitting the board behind it and not letting that tool sit flat, and I didn't recognize it. I cut the slots in all the boards and then did one final dry fit just to make sure everything was good before I glue up, and I used the biscuits in there as well. Now the last thing you want here is to run into an issue when you're 3 minutes deep into assembly with glue drying and you're going to start panicking. Believe me, I have been there. And after all that prep, the glue up does go a lot more smoothly since you know how everything fits together and you've already done it once. I glued one board at a time, putting the biscuits in for registration and lining the boards up with the marks that I'd made earlier. I only put glue on one side of each board and it's always served me well. Gluing both sides is overkill in my book and it's a lot messier. All you really want to have is some good glue squeeze out when you put the clamps on it, and then you know that you've got a good joint. I used a mallet to level out a few spots that had crept up, and then I put a few more clamps on the top. And after 45 minutes, I came back and I scraped the partially dried glue beads off of the top. And it makes final flattening a bit easier, plus it is super satisfying. Now the next day, I came back and I cleared out any of the knot holes in the table and gave it a rough sanding to 80 grit in those spots. And this is basically just to get rid of any glue around the knot holes so that I can make sure I cleanly filled them. The boards are full of different knots and imperfections, which I love because it adds some nice character. I marked all the spots that needed filling with blue tape and then I mixed up some epoxy. I'm using Total Boat High Performance with a fast hardener for the filling here. And instead of leaving it clear, I went ahead and added some black Mix-All tint to it. I think the black accents the knots without being too gaudy. I filled all the holes and I used a torch to release the bubbles and help level it a bit. I tried to top the knots off as the epoxy seeped into the cracks, but I came back a couple hours later and a few spots still needed more filling. So if you want to hit them in one shot, you're going to need to babysit those voids and keep adding epoxy until it all hardens. I decided to switch gears and jump to the metal base before finishing the tabletop, so then I could bounce back and forth between them while the finishes were drying. Now, the worst part about metalworking in a wood shop is the metal shavings go everywhere. So I decided to rig up a quick barrier to capture it before I spewed steel all over my shop. I used a big sheet of cardboard that I got from a plywood stack, and I cut and bent it to make a 4x4 box that was 12 inches deep, and I put that right behind my chop saw. It only took me a few minutes to make, and it was well worth the time and the effort. I think this might work. Now the table is going to have a metal base at each end, made from 1x3 rectangular tube steel. It's 1/8 inch thick. Each base is a T-shape on the floor with vertical supporting legs going up to a top plate. I started off by cutting the 6 vertical leg parts to rough size so that I could manage the steel a little bit easier. Now, each upright is square at the top and it's going to be joined into that lower T-shape with a 45-degree miter. I set the fins using a carpenter square, which I think is illegal when you're metalworking. I finished up cutting all the miters on the legs and then I switched to the lower T pieces. Now the longer top portion of the T has miters at both ends to match up with the legs. Now for this part and the smaller base piece, I positioned the metal seam down towards the floor. I finished up by cutting all of the legs to final size. A scrap block clamped down to the bench gave a stop to make repeatable cuts. And since I have 6 legs to deal with, the chances are pretty high that it can get out of whack. So starting with the exact size pieces at least gives me a fighting chance. Now next, I went outside and I ground down all the parts where they would be welded to give me a good base for the filler material to go. Now, I'm by no stretch a good welder yet, but I am learning. I have this small folding welding table that's a bit undersized for the task at hand, but using some right angle jigs and clamps, I was able to get everything aligned in place. My Lincoln Electric PowerMig 210MP, on the other hand, is more than capable for this job. I love this thing because it's simple as dialing in the wire size and the gauge of the steel that I'm using, and then I was ready to go. Now, figuring out the best way to assemble this was a good mental exercise, and I'm pretty sure that I'd do it the same way next time. I started by attaching the upright legs to that lower piece that had the 2 miters on it. I tacked those pieces in place, and then I marked and cut a top plate from 1/4-inch flat bar stock. The top plate is going to extend a few inches past the legs on each side for extra support for the top. I turned the assembly upside down on top of the flat bar, and then I pried it back into square using a spreader clamp. The heat from the welds on those miters that I'd already done tends to move things in, so the metal was inside a bit. Checking for square is really crucial before you weld your final pieces. After tacking the plate in place, I went around and I finished all the welds on this square assembly and made sure everything was sealed up. And then I clamped and welded together the 3rd leg and that small base piece. From there, I butted this assembly against the square that I had already made to form the T-shape. And the last piece of the puzzle was to flip the whole thing over and add another top plate to lock everything together. After that, I could repeat this entire process on the second base, and these are super sturdy. Now again, I am not a great welder by any stretch, but I hear grinder and paint make you the welder you ain't. So I got to grinding for a long time. Now before painting the bases, I hopped back to the tabletop so that I could fit the threaded inserts. I knocked off the majority of the epoxy with a block plane, and then I finished smoothing off the surface with 80 grit sandpaper. We had left the boards about 6 inches long when we milled them, which was great because I did have a little bit of snipe on the end of them. I measured in 3 inches from each side, and then I set my track saw square at 90 degrees to the long edge. Then I cut each end to give my final length for the table. After that, I could drill the mounting holes on the top of the metal bases. I put them at the ends of the T as well as the intersection. I used a step bit and I drilled them a little bit oversized to allow for wood movement. Then I hoofed the base up onto the top, which was bottom side up, so that I could mark for the inserts. And that grimace on my face means I need to stop skipping workouts. I put the base 12 inches in from the end and I centered it on the table, and then I drew pencil marks through each hole. Now, after that, I could take the bases off and prime and paint them outside with a matte black finish. While the paint was drying, I worked on finishing up the top. I added a chamfer on all the edges of the table. And if you start off putting the chamfer on the corner first and then you route around it on the top, you get this really cool looking detail on the corners. I finished up routing all the other edges and corners, and during the whole ordeal, we had to flip the top over a couple times. I really can't understate how heavy this thing is or how much I need to work out. But after I routed all the edges and sanded everything smooth, I decided to go ahead and apply finish to the bottom before doing the inserts. I'm using Rubio Pure as my finish, and it goes on easily, but you have to rub it in with a white Scotch-Brite pad. So I thought it would be smart to put it on my sander to do this. I poured finish in one spot, and then I put the sander down in the finish and turned it on and spread it around. And this worked great. But then I poured a big line of it and went into that line of finish with my sander running full bore. This did not work great. It slung finish all over my shop, so don't do that. Anyway, after that, I used a center punch where I'd made the pencil marks for the inserts, and then I drilled out the holes for them and I installed the inserts with an impact driver. We flipped over the table again so that I could finish off the top, and here's my recommended approach. Spread the finish on so that it's not pulled anywhere and it's got a nice coverage. Then you can go back with a sander with a white pad and buff things in. Unless you like spraying oil over your shop, then by all means go the other way. Now the nice thing about this table is that you can move it separately and attach it to the bases with set screws. And I'll have to wait until after lockdown to get some help so that I can move this into my dining room and get my dining room table out of there and everything in place.